We will now transition to the next vertical, the last one for today, which is new housing models. That's why I'm remembering. If you haven't visited the SOMA exposition or SOMA experience yet, make sure you do today or maybe during tomorrow. It is a fantastic experience, and you will find right in the exhibition area at the Port Vell Lounge. But here, let's continue welcoming, first of all, Ms. Clara Rius, architect and managing partner at AHEAD Barcelona Healthcare Architecture, and introducing Cleo Valentine, Vice Chancellor, Doctoral Scholar at the University of Cambridge and Senior Research and Innovation Lead at the Rius Research Institute of Sweden. Her research explores how architectural form influences neuropsychological stress with the aim of shaping healthier and more ethical built environments. Both will deliver a keynote talking about the relationship between architectural form and neuroimmunology in a new housing models. So without further ado, let's receive Clara Rius and Cleo Valentine. Just Cleo, and after Clara. Fantastic. So Cleo, whenever you want, floor is yours. Do you need the clicker?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Cool. Hello, thank you so much for having me, and thanks so much for staying late. I know it's late in the day. I appreciate everyone hanging around to listen to this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my research, which is on the topic of architectural neuroimmunology, and it's really a term that I use to describe the relationship between the built environment, the immune system, and the brain. And so neuroimmunology in and of itself is actually a relatively new discipline that examines this very, very intimate interplay between the nervous system and the immune system. And both the immune system and the nervous system play a very, very critical role in mediating our body's interaction with its environment. And this very much includes the built environment, which is something that we're increasingly learning about. So specifically, I'm going to speak a bit about the research that we've been doing examining specific features within the built environment in an attempt to really understand how we can use architecture and space as a tool for public health intervention. So I'm going to talk a bit about neurophysiological stress responses and how the built environment can elicit these responses and what that means both for the profession of architecture but also for the profession of public health more generally. So generally, my work can kind of be broken down into three primary categories. The first is theoretical models. So we work to develop kind of theoretical frameworks that really help to connect what are seemingly disparate domains of neuroscience and immunology and architectural studies to really explain how design shapes stress responses and how it can impact the body over time. The second is experimental work. So we use measures like heart rate variability, FNIRS, functional near-infrared spectroscopy, and devices like EEG, which record electrical activity in the brain, to try and see how in real time architectural features such as facades, patterns, and spatial rhythms in our environment actually impact the nervous system and the immune system. And increasingly, the work's actually been supported quite significantly by advancements in computational tools, such as generative AI and image analysis, and also computational tools and models of the primary visual cortex, which have been really interesting in our direct application to architectural practice more generally. And lastly, and actually kind of probably my favorite part of this work, is what all of this emerging research means from a bioethical perspective. What are our obligations as practitioners within the built environment to try and ensure that the spaces that we create fundamentally support human health and wellness? And so with this as sort of as a foundation, I'm going to introduce a few of these theoretical frameworks and also take you through probably faster than I had intended, but I feel like it's late, so I'm going to kind of zoom through a few of them, of the studies that we've been developing and the ways in which we've been applying this into policy, education, and practice. So I always like to start these talks with a kind of quick model of some of the physiological processes that we talk about in this research. Also, all of these slides have QR codes to the original studies if you're so inclined, but they're also kind of listed on my website as well. But this is a diagram from a recent paper of mine, and what we really see here is a simplified map of a stress event within the body. And so when I refer to the term stress, I'm referring to kind of any real or perceived threat to your psychological or your physiological integrity and well-being. So this can be anything from a physically traumatic accident to actually a space that's spatially disorienting, or, as you'll see in a second, spatial features that we really struggle to cognitively process. But I use stress in this instance as sort of an umbrella term. But in this specific model of stress, acute or short-term stress responses trigger something in the body called allostatic processes. They're sort of more commonly referred to as the body's fight or flight mechanism. And the response really aims to try and restore the body to a state of equilibrium, a state of homeostasis. And it does this through eliciting very, very specific responses in the body that actually help us to confront or ideally evade the stress-inducing incident. And acute stress, stress gets a lot of kind of negative press these days, but acute stress responses are actually fundamentally necessary. And they're very, very effective at protecting us, and they're very much essential for survival. It's really chronic stress. That's the kind of instances whereby stress responses become innately harmful. And chronic stress in and of itself tells a very, very different story. So the prolonged activation of these sort of neuroendocrine systems in the body can lead to kind of foundational wear and tear. So protective mechanisms that initially were there to kind of allow you to evade the stressor actually end up damaging the body and the tissues. And this very much includes the brain, which was kind of one of my initial areas of research. And chronic stress now is sort of known to be a foundational driver of a number of conditions, everything from mental health conditions, dementia, cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative conditions. But one really kind of interesting statistic is that the economic cost of stress-related illness is estimated upwards of £600 billion per year. So this is not an insignificant cost to society as well, on top of all of the harm and suffering that is caused by this. So there's quite compelling evidence to support the idea that architecture elicits stress responses, and that the built environment very much mediates this response. But to date, there had been very, very little consideration given to understanding what the extended exposure to stress response is. The fact that we spend every day, for the most part, in and around spaces that may be eliciting physiological stress responses. And so we became very, very interested in what the downstream impacts. What happens when you spend all of your time in environments that may fundamentally be eliciting a low-grade level of harm? And this is where we really started to draw in findings from the field of neuroimmunology. And so, as I mentioned, neuroimmunology kind of in and of itself is actually a relatively new discipline. So we're talking about 20 or so years. Historically, we very much thought that the brain was something that we called to be immune privileged, entirely disconnected from the immune system. And we now know that not to be the case whatsoever, actually. The stress responses that we see in the immune system have a very, very critical role in mediating our neurological health and wellness. And this kind of creates a very intimate and kind of delicate causality between our environmental stressors and our lived experience in our health. So neuroimmunology became a very profound framework for trying to understand how architecture is situated within the public health discourse. And we really tried to kind of investigate the ways in which we could use existing models to unpack this relationship. And one kind of seemingly simple but actually incredibly profound finding from neuroimmunological research more generally is that these stress responses are not discrete events. They actually create a cascade that kind of moves through the entirety of the body and can profoundly negatively impact health and wellness. So, as I mentioned, kind of neuroimmunological stress shows that what the brain perceives as a threat is highly contextual. So environmental features that fundamentally don't actually pose any direct risk are inherently benign. Things like window size, ceiling height, the lighting arrangement, high degrees of light flicker, or repetitive patterns, as you'll see in a second, can actually trigger physiological stress responses despite the fact that they actually don't pose any direct threat to your health and wellness. And these responses actually occur usually within seconds of exposure, which is really interesting from an architectural perspective. It means that the built environment can elicit these stress responses very, very quickly, but the nature of the exposure, the kind of chronic extended nature of the exposure, means that that harm may be elicited again and again and again and again. So that was really kind of the nature of some of our fundamental questions here, is that what happens when this exposure isn't fleeting and you can't evade the stressor? For instance, there was a specific situation whereby we found ourselves in a lecture theatre that had acoustic panels that fundamentally elicited a high degree of visual stress. But because people were forced to look at the screen for an extended period of time, it meant that you had a chronic degree of exposure in this instance, which I'll show you in a second. But because we spend days, hours, years within these environments, even subtle triggers can actually accumulate into something that we call allostatic overload, which is that state whereby the stress responses that were initially protective become harmful. And this kind of physiological wear and tear that we call it across the nervous system and the endocrine system and the immune system actually underlies a lot of the conditions that I mentioned before. Quickly, just to kind of throw this up here, these are two papers that kind of set out the kind of academic foundations for these papers. So the first is a conceptual piece, and it really looked to understand how might architectural features contribute to this state of allostatic overload, this harmful state of stress response. And it very much reviews evidence from both neuroimmunology and from neuroarchitecture. This kind of architectural neuroimmunology discipline is fundamentally very, very new and something that's still nascent and being developed. So this is one of the first, if I think the first paper actually, that really tried to set out this framework that we've been really trying to develop over time. And it actually highlighted a lot of the gaps between the stress biomarkers that we use in neuroimmunological research and the stress biomarkers that we use in architectural research to try and put together a slightly more kind of fleshed out framework for our understanding here. And the second paper on the right actually extends this thinking to the kind of remit of mental health. So it proposes a theoretical framework for how visual stressors, which I'll talk about in a moment, in the built environment might impact the body through these allostatic processes and how that might impact things like neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, which are foundational neurological mechanisms that enable health and wellness. But we're actually working on a third paper, which we're hoping to kind of come out probably around Christmas, which examines architectural stressors through an epigenetic lens and what the inherited impacts of spending all of your time and space in environments that fundamentally may not be supporting your health and wellness. So yes, the QR codes are all there if you'd like to kind of unpack them a little bit more. So I want to take a little bit of time, as I mentioned, I'll make it quicker than beforehand, but to kind of discuss some of the experimental work that we've been doing, because the stuff I've been talking about to date is very much theoretical, and architecture is a very fickle beast when it comes to examining, because there's so many confounding variables in how we're actually experiencing the space. But I've picked out two papers that engage with these questions at different architectural scales and contexts, and they focus highly on the methodologies that we're trying to develop, which allow other researchers to apply these to their kind of projects as well. But up until now, I should kind of preface by saying that the majority of my work really focuses on visual stress. But architecture is fundamentally a multisensory experience. So we're looking to try and extend this into the remit of acoustics and thermal comfort and other kind of sensory inputs that very much impact our experience of space. Before I do get into it, I have to put this health warning up always. Some of the images on the next few slides do actually include patterns that have high degrees of visual stress. So if you do have a condition or you're sensitive to visual patterns, then I would recommend maybe averting your gaze for the next slide or two. So what do I mean? We've been looking at something called, I've been mentioning visual stress a lot, but we're specifically looking at something called high contrast, regular, repetitive visual patterns. And it seems very benign, but once I show you a few more pictures, you'll actually see how common these specific forms are in the natural world. But what exactly do I mean by that? But this work very much builds on research from University of Cambridge, from Arnold Wilkins and someone named Ian Hosking. And our work really examines the impact of these regular, repetitive, high contrast forms, these stripes on the visual system. And interestingly, exposure to these patterns can actually overstimulate the primary visual cortex. And this is especially the case when the patterns exhibit specific types of spatial frequencies. It isn't always the case. It has to be the exact right size and your kind of viewing distance and your spatial positionality changes that quite significantly, but it actually has a profound impact on health and wellness, and we're seeing that a lot right now. Spatial frequency, just for reference, for those who don't know, it actually refers to the number of changes in visual information, such as light or dark patterns per unit of space in an image. So it's a very specific mathematical equation. But what do I mean when I say kind of an increased activity in the primary visual cortex? So what this means is that we see a spike in the metabolic response. It means that your brain is working very, very hard to try and process the world around it. And that can actually, as it turns out, create a cascading stress response in the body that actually primes you for kind of additional levels of allostatic load going forwards. And this overstimulation, kind of at its most benign, can lead to visual discomfort and things like impaired task performance, so reading rates. And also, in extreme cases, it can actually trigger migraines and seizures in specific individuals. So it can have very profound and lasting impacts. So while the presence of these patterns, as I mentioned, these high contrast, regular, repetitive forms might seem inconsequential, like I said, they actually become kind of hard to ignore once you notice them. And I've actually spoken to a number of people who have actually been reported being unable to enter certain environments because they see these visual patterns and they actually elicit very profound changes in the body. I've had a number of architecture and engineering firms who've come to me retroactively, said that they've had to alter spaces because the environment they've created actually was inhibiting people's ability to read and exist in this space. So it's not an inconsequential question, but also the underlying mechanism that drive it is particularly interesting and important because it really extends the remit of architectural experience from something that's nice to have to something that we actually critically need to consider. As all scientists, it's very important that I really state here that people have varying degrees of sensitivity in this context. So what the numbers that we're working with right now say that about 10 to 20% of people will develop clinically significant findings in these instances. But we recently ran a study actually in Barcelona last summer, which showed that it was maybe more like 45 to 50% of people experience some level of discomfort. And the question here really seems to be about exposure as well as sensitivity. What happens, again, I'll keep saying it, but it's when you're forced to exist in a space for an extended period of time that fundamentally undermines your body's ability to process and exist in very specific ways that I'll explain. But in this instance, we're very much testing that kind of 10 to 20% that elicits clinical outcomes. Again, like all scientists, we always kind of come back to the question as to why. Why might it be the case that specific environments and specific forms may cause physical discomfort in the body? It doesn't really make a ton of sense. As I mentioned, the types of environments we're talking about are fundamentally, they're seemingly benign, and yet they're very much not. So one theory suggests that our visual system actually evolved to efficiently process images commonly found in natural environments. So visual processing is most effective when the visual scene or the images that we're looking at have spatial characteristics that are found in organic material. And that's very much the case that we evolved to visually process them. So we're very efficient at doing it. So natural images, although you can see here, they're very diverse in their kind of foundational content. They actually share very similar statistical features, something that we call the 1/f Fourier amplitude spectrum. And this is important because it allows us to quantify its impact or its presence in architectural forms as well. And this 1/f Fourier amplitude spectrum actually facilitates efficient encoding by the cortical neurons and fundamentally impacts our ability to regulate stress responses. But departures from these natural image properties, many of which, as I've mentioned, are more commonly encountered in contemporary urban and architectural environments, actually have the potential to induce this visual discomfort and stress. They increase this metabolic rate in the primary visual cortex and force your brain basically to work very, very hard to understand what it's looking at. And this has this cascading effect through the body from a stress perspective. So the unnatural image properties, as it were, are things like these high contrast, regular, repetitive forms, strong degrees of luminance contrasts, and high degrees of a light flicker. Lighting is a hugely impactful architectural feature that impacts health and wellness in ways that we haven't really understood up until recently. And the kind of cortical excitation, or this metabolic peak that I've been talking about, is thought to occur because we fundamentally do not have the ability, we didn't evolve with the ability to visually process these environments. We've never come across them before. So this is a very low resolution video. I've tried for many years to try and find a high resolution version of it, but I've not been able to. But I think it illustrates my point really well. So I'm going to let it play in a second, but I just want to give a little bit of context. So humans have been on Earth for roughly 200,000 years. Something like that. But there's actually only evidence of urban settlements dating back about 6,000 years. So fundamentally, humans are very, very new to urban living, and they're even newer to the types of contemporary urban living that we all experience on a daily basis. And this has profound impacts for our ability to process and understand what's going on. So I'm going to let this play, but I'll just speak over it quickly. This is a video, a time-lapse video from the New York Times, and it shows 500 years of architectural development on Manhattan. And I'll just let that play for a second. So you can see here how dramatically and how quickly the built environment has changed. We're fundamentally living in a space that our species has never experienced before, and that has profound impacts on the ways in which our body regulates itself. And our body and our biology adapts significantly slower than that rate of urban development. So one estimate, and this is contentious, but by one estimate, it takes around 4,000 generations for a lasting evolutionary trait to become fully embedded within a species. And I'm talking about an embedded trait with regards to visual processing. There are things like altitude adjustments that are quicker, but when it comes to actually spatial processing, we're talking about thousands of generations, which means that we're fundamentally not very well equipped to exist in the space that we spend all of our time. And this is kind of why I argue that the built environment, it's fundamentally not just a background. It's not the background to our daily life. It's social infrastructure. It foundationally is social infrastructure, and it actually plays a profound impact in our human health and wellness. And I think actually, by some accounts, evolution is the world's best R&D lab. So actually turning to these kind of natural and organic forms can be profoundly impactful from that perspective. So in this first paper, I'm going to take you through 2 or 3 kind of reasonably quick studies that we've done that try and illustrate this point and help us to develop methodologies to understand what's going on in the body when we exist in space, and how can we design in ways that fundamentally support human health and wellness. And I'll talk a little bit about why this is a really difficult question to actually get into, but also why I think it's so important. So we set out in this first paper to understand how certain architectural facade patterns, facades are kind of viewed as the skin of the building, but it's also something that we all experience on a day-to-day basis. But we were specifically looking at how these high contrast, regular repetitive forms, these stripes that elicit that high degree of metabolic activity in the V1 cortex, how they might impact stress responses throughout the body. So we wanted to look at the brain, but we also wanted to look at systemic stress. Do we see it cascading? Do we see it changing your heart rate or your heart rate variability? So that's what we ended up doing here. And we tried to do a thing where we combined computational analysis and generative AI. And this actually allowed us to model and test these visual patterns in a very, very specific way, because as I'll talk about in a second, testing architecture is really hard. It is not an easy thing to do. We do not have controlled case studies. We do not have controlled environments. That's not how we experience space. So one thing that we're working on trying to do in this field is trying to develop innovative methodologies that can actually be applied at scale to large volumes of architectural imagery, because there's so much variety in the spaces that we experience. But also a question that we'll talk about a little bit later is, what do we do with this information once we have it? How do we actually apply this knowledge to the architectural profession so that it is not that we're retroactively testing buildings once they're completed. It's that we're actually providing meaningful and insightful evidence at the outset, and that's easier said than done. But this work, interestingly, was actually funded by an architecture firm. Heatherwork Studios is running something called the Humanize campaign, which is fundamentally looking to try and humanize the experience of architecture and understand how we design and build spaces that support the lived experience. So just a quick overview of neuroarchitectural methodologies in this specific context. There are a few different ways that we can impact or examine the impact of visual exposure to the built environment on human neurophysiology. The first thing is that we can do mathematical analysis. So we can evaluate spatial properties using something called a Fourier analysis. We can assess the luminance contrast or the degree of chromaticity in the architectural image. We can actually mathematically assess the composition of the image and predict what its impact on the body will be. The second thing is that we can do user impact assessment, very underrated these days, but actually asking people how they feel in space, profoundly impactful, and something that we need to very much integrate into sort of our higher order clinical biomarker studies. And the last thing is neuroimaging. So we'll look to record cortical responses using techniques like fMRI or FNIRS. And for those of you who aren't familiar with FNIRS, the way I describe it is like if an MRI machine and an EEG had a baby. So it's a cap that you wear on the head and actually shines infrared light into the brain. And that infrared light reflects off the oxygen in the blood, and it actually allows us to calculate the metabolic rate to show how hard your visual cortex is working when you're looking at an image. And it's a very, very good indicator for probable visual stress responses to the built environment. Again, as a scientist, I always have to kind of qualify and put some kind of prefaces up front. Not everybody experiences these patterns the same way, and they're also not experienced the same way statically. The positionality of the built environment is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to study architecture. We're constantly moving in and around these spaces, and that changes our viewing angle, it changes our viewing distance, it changes the nature of our lived experience foundationally. And this is one of the reasons why we tried to develop the study the way we have, which I'll explain in a second. But to do this, we developed a two-part study that uses these kind of combined or joined methodologies to try and understand the impact of these visual forms on the human response in space. And the hypothesis really was that architectural facades that embodied these high contrast, regular, repetitive forms would result in inefficient cortical processing in the brain and also an increased systemic stress response in the body more generally. Again, I'll go through this reasonably quickly, but I think it's really important to kind of highlight why and how and what limitations we face in architectural research more generally. I'll go through this reasonably fast because I know it's late, but basically there are different ways in which we can test architectural environments. We can assess photographs, which is actually quite like profoundly impactful and does do a decent job at creating a visual representation of the lived experience. We can also do things like architectural renderings, and things like Midjourney and generative AI have allowed us to create incredibly large volumes of architectural imagery under highly controlled situations. We can test simple patterns, but mostly we can also test, in situ renderings, which is why we try and use kind of a joined process whereby we'll evaluate architectural imagery, then we'll test people in the lab, and then we'll try and test people in the real world and try and understand how we can actually create predictive models. But they all have limitations, and I think that that's really important for me to note here, because again, this research is very much in its infancy, and it's something that we're working kind of collectively as a field to develop over time. But it's also it's good science for me to always preface that. So. In this specific study, we tried to develop this hybrid method. So we combined generative AI, I have an animation too, which I always forget, and a kind of Fourier-based computational tool, which we're actually now applying to projects, and I'll explain it. It's called the Visual Stress Analysis tool, the VISTA tool. So it's actually a computational program that we've been developing and writing that allows us to assess architectural designs during the design process, not retroactively, and provide real-time feedback to designers, which is profoundly impactful, both from a real estate development perspective, but also just from a designer perspective. But in this instance, we actually use generative AI to create numerous permutations and combinations of the same environment, but with different visual patterns. So creating an isolated environment whereby the trees and the streetscape and everything was the same, but the actual facade itself changed, allowed us to try and understand exactly which features within the built environment were eliciting these responses and why. And this allows us to kind of try and isolate the architectural features that actually might be doing this. So here are the facades in question, or at least a sample of them. So you can see here we kept the base geometry the same, the trees, the streetscape, and the first floor, and we created these permutations and combinations of the upper level with varying degrees of visual complexity, degrees of curvature, high contrast, regular, repetitive patterns, and specific architectural interventions like those black and white stripes there that we hypothesized would actually elicit that visual stress response. And I'm very, very happy. I mean, it's bad that it happens, but I'm happy from a scientific perspective that actually our hypothesis was correct. And this is really interesting in terms of calibrating our tool. So, as I mentioned, we have been applying this tool called VISTA, which we've been now kind of applying at scale, and we're actually running a study now across all the Harvard psychiatric inpatient care units to try and understand how we can understand the ways in which architectural imagery and visual exposure to specific patterns elicit this response. So what this does here is that we actually upload images, and we've actually extended it to videos as well, which allows for that variation in the lived experience and the viewing angle. It's incredibly important to have live and active visual processing stimuli in these instances. And then we create a mathematical computational image analysis where we look at things like the viewing angle and the spatial frequency, the duty cycle, and the contrast. So these are all mathematical equations that we can derive from the architectural imagery. And the reason why this is a particularly exciting development in our field is because it means that we don't have to be running clinical studies for every building. We don't have to test every single space. We use these experimental test cases to calibrate tools that we then deploy and apply during the design process. And so it's been a huge jump in the application of this science to practice, which is one of the hardest parts of this field in general, actually, right now. This is what VISTA does. It creates these heat maps that actually isolate and show the yellow areas which are regions that your V1, your visual cortex, will be working extremely hard to process. Interestingly, here, you'll actually see the trees lit up as well. It's not the case that those elicit that same degree of visual stress response, but it's because it's not a normalized curve. So as we're doing the UI UX design, it really actually should be blue, because those are visual patterns that are very, very easy for us to process neurologically, whereas the strong deviations, like you can see up there on the left, are incredibly difficult and actually elicit that stress response. Won't go through these, but these are the results of the study. The interesting thing is actually that the mathematical prediction tools are incredibly good. And they're getting better and better. And every time that we're able to run an experimental study in controlled lab environments, we're able to calibrate them even further. Again, I'm very much kind of a theoretical and lab-based practitioner usually, but increasingly I've just taken a job in industry, and I'm trying to wrap my head around the ways in which we can make this research actually relevant. I think that a lot of our fear is that we publish papers that will live and die on PubMed, and I don't think that design practitioners are necessarily perusing through PubMed and reading academic papers, because A, they're kind of boring, mine certainly are, and we're trying to find ways in which this can be applied in kind of more engaging environments. So this is a very, very exciting development, I think. But important to note, we have to calibrate them. So we write the computational scripts, and then we run empirical, controlled studies that allow us to try and isolate specific features and also try and isolate specific subpopulations. So people with ADHD, for example, may have different sensory processing to those with dementia. And that's a really critical variation that we need to try and wrap our heads around. I'll show you in the next slide where we actually evaluated domestic violence refuges, whereby people very often have high degrees of complex PTSD and PTSD, which fundamentally impacts your ability to sensory process. So this is actually another paper where we're looking at bias, specifically around cultural bias, because people do experience space differently, and we're trying to use generative AI and these computational tools to extend our remit and our reach and try and kind of unpack questions. I won't go into it right now, but if anyone's so inclined, I do put the QR codes for that reason. So this paper I think is particularly relevant though, so I'm going to go through it again reasonably fast, but I think it's very relevant to the conversations that we're having today. So in this paper, whereas before we used generative AI to create one architectural stimuli with variations in it, in this instance, we actually looked at one building typology, so these domestic violence refuges in Australia. And we did this because emotional trauma, in many instances, can cause significant alterations in brain structure, and it can lead to heightened sensory sensitivity through this dysregulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the body's stress response system, as I mentioned. Interestingly, we see similar responses in ADHD in dementia cases. This alteration in sensory processing is quite prevalent. So these specific typology-based studies are really interesting, which is one of the reasons why we're running it in the psychiatric inpatient care units now in Boston. I won't go into too much detail here, but there are very, very specific reasons why things like complex PTSD and PTSD actually increase sensory sensitivity. And there's this very strong theoretical framework for understanding how this might happen and why sensory processing may be changed in these specific instances. But in many instances, what we are seeing is that it does create an over-responsive visual system, which really contributes to hypervigilance and visual discomfort. And this is particularly interesting, as I'll show you in a second, because actually a lot of the spatial interventions that we are seeing that designers actually use to try and create safer and calmer environments were eliciting visual stress responses. One specific one is that acoustic panels, for a very interesting reason that I don't quite explain, seem to elicit the highest degree of visual stress. The spatial distribution of acoustic panels that's most effective at dampening sounds creates the highest level of visual stress. So we get into really interesting conversations around balancing needs and trying to understand context in these instances. So this is what it looks like when we use Vista. In this specific instance, we used 60 interior photographs of 2 facilities, and we actually quantified their impact using the Vista tool to measure these visual stress characteristics. And the goal was really to kind of map these visual stressors within the environments that may be heightening this hyperarousal. Visual stress and sensory sensitivity in general also does create a higher degree of vigilance across the board. So if you're looking at visual stress, we see this multimodal sensory response, whereby suddenly you become more sensitive to acoustic stress as well, and you become more sensitive to thermal stress as well. We have an integrated sensory system. So although we're looking at vision, we're really talking about sensory overload in general. And we wanted to try and understand and identify features that might be eliciting this response. So we've mapped them out in this study, whereby we've identified 8 kind of primary characteristics in architectural settings that may elicit these visual stress responses. I'm happy, I can go through them very briefly now, but particularly things like acoustic treatments. Lighting is huge. High degrees of light flicker have a profound impact on the body. But also things like visual patterns. We're seeing ventilation as well, causing visual discomfort. In some instances, people would be having conversations and actually see the wall kind of actually starting to move behind them because of the visual distortion, which fundamentally takes you out of the present moment and creates a sense of sensory overload in these instances. The interesting thing is that the remedies are reasonably simple. It's about having the knowledge at the right point in time during the design process, and also having the ability to potentially retrofit spaces that may not be serving your kind of populations as best as they can. I won't go into this now because I think that I'm almost at my time, more or less. But what we're doing now is we're actually applying it at the urban scale. So I just presented this research at the Seoul Architecture Biennale, whereby we identified 500 years of architectural typologies, used GIS to pick out 80 different buildings, photographed them from different viewing angles and distances, assessed them with this Vista tool, and identified specific architectural features, and basically mapped them back to construction techniques, socio-political shifts in the kind of built environment generally, and tried to really understand why it might be the case that the built environment as we currently experience it, in many instances, does elicit a large degree of visual stress and sensory overload. Contemporary architectural environments, in some instances, can be incredibly noxious, if not overtly kind of visually violent in some ways, I would say. So this is a really interesting paper whereby we're trying to contextualize and try and understand how changes in prefabricated architectural techniques, what are the econometric drivers behind some of the choices that have been made within the remit of the built environment, because it impacts policy directly. Our ability to understand why things get built, who built them, who they're built for, and who will be experiencing them going forward is kind of a fundamental driver behind the ways in which we can try and apply this knowledge to building regulations and architectural policy in general. So this is a really cool paper, and actually I'm very happy after many, many months. It was approved for publication this morning, so I'm very, very thrilled. And we're actually replicating the study in a number of different cities to try and look at cross-cultural variation as well. So I think we're going to be doing it in New York, LA, maybe Barcelona, Stockholm, and Santiago, I think. So if anyone else knows of any other architectural environments that they'd be particularly inclined to try and investigate, we'd be very happy to apply the methodology. But the interesting thing here is that we actually did notice very profound shifts, you'll see here, in differences between traditional architectural typologies and contemporary architectural environments. We're really trying to unpack why, but it does seem to be the case that it's the presence of things like these organic patterns, material variation, and the application of the human scale, many of which fundamentally changed with prefabricated architectural techniques. It was interesting in the Seoul instance because the volume of urban development that happened in 400 years across the city of London happened in 40 years in Korea. So specific environments whereby we're building a tremendous amount of units at scale and for low cost out of necessity, are particular instances whereby I think we need to be really, really alive to the ways in which this regular repetitive forms and architectural typologies can actually fundamentally undermine human health and wellness in the built environment. And actually I'm putting together a study right now which is on the econometric impacts of this. What is the cost to society from an economic perspective with respect to public health interventions? Are these architectural environments fundamentally making us sicker? And what does that mean for society in general? And trying to kind of create these different economic frameworks whereby we can kind of encourage architectural interventions that support human health and wellness. But it very much comes down to these kind of very simple principles around using organic materials, taking inspiration from the natural world, and finding ways to apply and build that actually humans relate to fundamentally. This leads me to kind of the last bit here, which is my favorite piece of all of this work, which is what does this mean? What does this mean from an ethical perspective? Because I actually feel as though, practitioners in the built environment, we have an ethical and a moral obligation to try and create spaces that fundamentally support human health and wellness. So the paper on the left here was actually published in the British Medical Journal, which is a really exciting development for the field, because generally I feel as though we kind of spend a lot of time in the design world speaking to ourselves. So trying to find ways ways that we can apply this knowledge to different disciplines and have other people in the room, it really, really opens up different ways of trying to apply knowledge at scale. And the paper on the right here actually unpacks in a little bit more detail the ways in which we need to engage with this as a discipline more generally. And so this is a paper that my colleague Heather Mitchell-Tree and I put together. But interestingly, from the Royal Institute of British Architects, the Canadian architecture associations are the same, the Americans and the Australians. Almost all governing bodies state a do no harm principle, very similar to medicine. We fundamentally do have an ethical obligation to engage in these questions and to try and actually understand how design impacts human health and wellness. And I'd very much make the argument that design in the built environment is one of the most powerful tools for public health intervention because its impacts are experienced passively. So there's a tremendous amount of potential within this field more generally, and we're trying to kind of find ways in which we can unpack that and apply it. Again, lots of challenges around that generally, things like integration and competing priorities, which is why the economic framework is very compelling. Integrating this into planning policy, into building regulations, getting different people in the room. I've been sort of bouncing around faculties. I started in architecture, I moved into computational neuroscience. Now I'm in a public health faculty, and then I was in a computational urban planning faculty. And every different discipline has its own ways of viewing the same problems. And it's very much in everyone's best interest to find the ways in which we overlap and try and kind of spark new ideas and ways of combating this. So this paper kind of unpacks it. And the last bit here is the accessible tools, which is sort of my hyperfixation at the moment. How can we take this knowledge out of the lab, out of PubMed, and put it into the hands of designers, put it into the hands of building regulators, of planning policy professionals, of urban planners generally, and of healthcare practitioners, of people who fundamentally are creating spaces, operating in spaces, and real estate developers, and people who run healthcare facilities. This is knowledge that should be publicly available, that we should work very, very hard as a discipline to kind of apply at scale, and that's really what we're trying to do here. So I know it's late. I tried to keep it pretty tight. I can talk about this for a very long time, but it's late, and I guess I just wanted to kind of end by saying that I actually think that the built environment has a profound impact on human health and wellness, and it is very much in our collective best interest to try and engage with the ways in which we can use it to support human health and wellness. Thanks.
I don't know, we sit here.
Yeah, okay.
Well, thank you, Cleo. Thanks to everyone. We know it's late. Let us just have a 5-minute talk. Thanks for your amazing talk, amazing research and results. From the practitioner point of view, we are really aligned on the do not harm principle. Because we need to take responsibility of what we are designing, that spaces really can do harm to people, and especially if we are in this forum with mental health or vulnerability, so important to have more research. I would like to share a real case that happened to in our studio. We were designing a mental health inpatient building. The project was almost finished, the construction, to its construction. And then we met Cleo in Barcelona.
With in the back, I'm so sorry.
with this presentation, more or less, most of it. And so we thought, okay, what is this visual discomfort that facades can actually impact on some users? And our project, our facades, could have this impact or this negative impact on people. So we had two options. One, pretend we didn't met with Cleo. We didn't hear anything about what she said. Of course, it's not life or death matter. Probably no one would link the discomfort with the facade design. And then the second option was, okay, let's go back, let's read the articles again, let's do some deeper research. And of course, we we did the second option, also dealing with some frustration with people that had been working weeks and months on that design. I mean, it's not easy, but I think the design process, it's not aligned. We have to, go back and forth, and this is what actually matters. So we redesigned the facade. Hope it will be okay following your research. So just let me ask you, I don't know if you are a unique case during doing this research on neuroimmunology, because this is quite a recent research. How this will evolve, or do you know more people or more universities doing research in this field?
Yeah, I mean, well, architecture, first of all, with the, I think that you mentioned the team that worked on the facade.
Yes,
that
yeah, they love you.
Sorry, guys. I think it's one of the profound frustrations that we have is that actually a lot of this knowledge is something that we acquire retroactively. I think it's one of the reasons why the computational tools I'm hoping are particularly impactful, because it must be really difficult and frustrating to design something, test a building, and realize that it hasn't performed in the ways that you want. So predictive tools, I think, are profoundly impactful from that perspective. But they're the product of research that has yet to be done in many instances. Neuroarchitecture, as a general field, has only been around for maybe, I mean, the innate knowledge is thousands of years old. The kind of visceral feeling that the built environment impacts human health and wellness is not something that is new. But the explicit study of it from an experimental perspective is newer, and we're looking at kind of 20 years of knowledge. The interesting kind of shift that happened from my perspective was trying to connect it to things like neuroimmunology and stress research, to pull in different frameworks from different fields and kind of apply it directly onto the architectural lens. It's something that's shifted tremendously in the last kind of 3 to 5 years. I think I've seen an explosion of research labs. Cambridge, we're launching our new neuroarchitectural and neurourbanism research lab that specifically looks at building typologies and their impact on human health and wellness, but also practitioner-based research initiatives, which is also incredibly new and interesting. I've just started this job as an in-house neuroarchitectural researcher at a design firm, which is kind of unprecedented, and also has a number of challenges associated with it. How do we actually apply experimental research in practice? How do we ensure that it's done rigorously and robustly? What are our ethical obligations in these instances? I mean, I kind of always describe this research generally as like a foundational act of care. It's the act of trying to understand the ways in which we can use space to create health and wellness, but also all my work really focuses on the ways in which we currently build that inadvertently cause harm. And I think that there's a lot of ways that we do that. So I'm hoping that there's sort of a shift in the field. This kind of practitioner, industry, academia partnership is a fickle beast, but one that is necessary, because architecture is a profession foundationally, and there's a very, very discrete line that seems to be drawn within architecture faculties, whereby researchers and designers very rarely speak, and it is in our kind of collective best interest to disintegrate that, or else we have instances whereby research comes out later that undermines design efforts that are foundationally well-intentioned. And that was one of the interesting things with the domestic violence refuge studies, as I mentioned. There were specific architectural interventions that you could tell came from a place of care, whereby someone was trying their very best to elicit a response or create an environment that supported health and wellness, but kind of with additional knowledge, we realized that there's actually a little bit more nuance behind it. So I think in all of these instances, like you said, the design process isn't linear, and it's something that even when we were doing the SOUL study, these buildings have been made and remade, thousands, hundreds of thousands of times. So it's a lived process, but it is definitely, it's not an easy field.
Yes, and also having research inside the practice, it's important, and it's it's something new, it's also how you do it with rigor and not just reading and applying it. I think academia and universities and practice are, at least we are looking at each other.
They're flirting a bit.
A little bit, but I think how to make it possible, how to make it even for healthcare stakeholders that they listen to us or to the research and they really pay attention. Because actually we are dealing with healthcare stakeholders, hospitals. They are in a scientific evidence base, their work. But then when it comes to constructing buildings or the design, I think it's also our job to make them clear and to measure, to do post-occupancy evaluation. And so when you have some indicators, probably it's easier. But still a long time to go.
It's a work in progress for sure.
Yes.
And again, I'm hoping that these computational tools help. One thing that we've been doing actually is trying to identify specific building typologies or specific buildings themselves and then apply for research grants for us to do evaluation of it. So actually the stakeholders doesn't take that cost on, but they very much kind of reap the benefits of it. And so that is a very interesting model that we're exploring more, because I think that there are ways in which we can kind of combine academic inquiry with design kind of intervention within specific economic remits that actually allow for this research to happen and be applied. So ways like that, I think it's just about being creative and trying to find ways in which we can explore these more. But
creative time and and just continue to do research, and I think in this kind of audience is very important. I don't know if I have time for questions for the audience. They say no, so but I don't know.
yeah, it's also very late. If it comes
Yes,
to you later, you can always
if
email
not, we
me.
can
I feel bad
talk
for
on
being so
the.
late. Okay,
Yeah.
sure.
And just a quick note, as you mentioned, we constructed the living lab on the exhibitor's room. It's a SOMA experience. Go there and do your experience. It takes only 2 minutes. And you will, I don't know, perceive, well, I'm not saying anything, just go there, and it's good because we're also doing some questions, and as many as we have, it will be better for the results. So thanks, Cleo. Well, thank you. We appreciate very much your research and your sharing, and we can speak with her here afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you.